Hello viewers, we are going to learn about a few theories of learning, among which today we will learn about classical conditioning. I suppose some of you already know what conditioning means, and maybe some of you are acquainted with Pavlov's experiment also. But in today's lecture, we will go into these things in detail, and we will try to understand how the principles of classical conditioning operate in case of various spheres of our life. Classical conditioning assumes that learning can be explained in terms of association. What happens is that in case of conditioning, there is a neutral stimulus which, by virtue of its occurrence in close time and space with another natural stimulus that gives rise to a natural response, becomes capable of eliciting that natural response even in absence of the natural stimulus. You see, in case of classical conditioning, there are actually two kinds of stimuli, and there are responses not of two kinds but of one kind only. There is one stimulus which naturally gives rise to one kind of response. Then there is another neutral stimulus which is associated with that earlier stimulus, and then this neutral response, it gives rise to the same kind of response that was generated by the first stimulus. Please remember one thing, that this kind of association operates mostly for the reflexive or spontaneous responses. You see, there are two kinds of responses. One is known as reflexive or spontaneous, the other is known as operant. Here we are concerned only with those reflexive or spontaneous responses, because only such responses can be classically conditioned. By reflexive or spontaneous responses, what we mean is that those kinds of responses that are closely related to our survival. Maybe many of you know that Pavlov's basic experiment was with the response of salivation of dogs. Then we have other responses which are related biologically to our basic survival. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, he was working at St. Petersburg. He had been working for long with the system of digestion, the digestive process of dogs in the laboratory. Although he is famous not for his works on digestive processes, but for his work on learning, initially he was not concerned with learning at all. He was working with a dog. Let me give you an overview of the experiment by Pavlov. There was this dog comfortably bound by a collar in a given closed space, and what Pavlov was trying to do, he was trying to see the digestive process as measured through salivation when meat powder is given in the mouth of the dog. So there was a food pellet, meat powder was being given there, the dog was supposed to eat the meat powder from there. Pavlov was trying to measure the amount of salivation that was coming out in response to the stimulus, that is meat powder. You see, as I was telling earlier, if meat powder is the basic stimulus, salivation was the natural response to it. Then for helping in the precision of the measurement, what Pavlov did, he wanted to keep the exact time for measuring the salivation, and so he introduced a light or sometimes a bell just before giving the meat powder. He thought that that will help the precision of the measurement of the salivation. It went well for 1 or 2 or 3 trials, but then what happened is that Pavlov found that the dog started salivating when the bell was being rung or when the light was being alighted, even before the meat powder was given in the food pellet. So initially in the first few sessions there is food pellet which gives rise to the natural response of salivation. There is a bell or a light associated with it. Naturally, initially there is no salivation. But then during conditioning, it so happened that bell food pellet salivation, after conditioning, when the bell was ringing, the dog started salivating. So when these two stimuli were given as different stimuli, not in association with each other, there was no salivation in case of bell. But after a few trials with bell and food pellet, there was salivation as a result, and finally there was salivation as a result of hearing the sound of the bell only. So in the last condition, when the dog starts to associate the natural response of salivation to the neutral stimulus of bell, we call that classical conditioning. So you see there are four kinds of stimuli and responses here. One is known as the unconditioned stimulus or UCS, the natural stimulus that elicits a natural response. In this case, the meat powder on the food pellet was the UCS. Then there is the unconditioned response, that is UCR, the natural response elicited to the natural stimulus. In Pavlov's experiment, salivation in response to meat powder on the food pellet is the UCR. Then there is the conditioned stimulus CS, that is the neutral stimulus that does not automatically generate the target response, but which, after being associated for a number of times with the UCS, can generate the specific response. And then finally there is the conditioned response, which is in terms of quality almost same to the unconditioned response, that is in both cases it is salivation, but conditioned response is the salivation which is generated by the bell or the light, that is the neutral stimulation, which was not supposed to generate this particular response. So these are the four components of classical conditioning. Now we can replace the food pellet and the bell with this kind of schema. You see there is the unconditional stimulus, that is the food pellet, which naturally gives rise to salivation, that is the UCR, unconditioned response. When the bell is given, it is not a real stimulus at all, because there is no salivation in response to bell, whatever other responses are there like pricking of the ear or whatever. During conditioning, what is being done? The conditioned stimulus, that is the bell, precedes the UCS, that is the food pellet, just by a few seconds. Of course, it is followed by unconditioned response, that is salivation. But after a number of trials, only the CS, the conditioned stimulus, that is the bell, gives rise to CR, that is the salivation. We may readily understand that initially Pavlov was a bit confused about this experiment, because he really did not want the salivation to come in response to the bell. But then he understood that this is a discovery which is probably much more important, and in 1927 and then once again in 1928 he published his results, which became which immediately became the research topic of many other workers all around the world. Now you see, this kind of experiment requires that after the bell, the meat powder has to be given. That is, some kind of reward is being given. This is known as reinforcement. The technical definition of reinforcement is that it is the presentation or removal of a stimulus to maintain or increase the probability of a target response. That is, because the meat powder is being given, the presentation of the stimulus, here the stimulus is the meat powder, this is being presented. Why? To maintain or increase the probability of the target response, that is salivation, which means unless you give the meat powder, there will be no salivation. We can see that reinforcement can be primary or secondary, it can be positive or negative also. We can also understand that in case of Pavlov's dog, this dog wanted to have the meat powder. So this is an anticipatory or approach kind of response. But what happens if you give a shock instead of the meat powder to the dog? Then the dog will learn to lift its leg automatically. Again, that is a spontaneous or reflexive response. Now, in response to a shock, the dog will lift its leg. If you associate a bell just as you associated it with the meat powder, this association will result in the dog's lifting of the legs even at the sound of the bell. So this will be withdrawal response. Thus, as I said, reinforcement can be positive or negative. When it is a shock, it is of negative quality and it may result in withdrawal response. Now, let's try to understand what happens if we do not give the meat powder at all. Suppose you have associated meat powder and bell in such a way through conditioning so that the presence of the bell, the ringing of the bell, it gives rise to the salivation as conditioned response. But then in some trials, you do not give the meat powder. That is, you do not give the reinforcement which is required to maintain the classical conditioning. So, if trial after trial, if you do not give the meat powder or whatever reinforcement you have been using so far, then gradually the response will die away. It will be extinct, or in other words, deconditioning will take place because there has been a failure to reinforce the basic association. Learning in this way does not necessarily mean that the response has been conditioned with the stimulus, with the neutral stimulus for good. Unless you keep a maintenance of the thing by regular reinforcement, then it will so happen that gradually the learning will be undone. There will be unlearning, there will be deconditioning, there will be extinction. However, again, as I said, learning is not forever. Similarly, extinction is also not forever. Suppose the dog has not been given meat powder after the ringing of the bell for quite a number of trials. The salivation in response to bell has decreased or has become completely extinct. The dog does not salivate any longer in response to the bell. But then if suddenly once again you start giving meat powder on the food pellet, once or twice or thrice, if you repeat this, maybe you will find that the dog again starts salivating. It will not take as many trials that was required initially to condition the dog. It will take much fewer trials, and again the conditioning will be established with much little effort. You can readily understand it because sometimes, of course, you have observed that if you have learned something well at one time, then maybe you have forgotten it. But it may so happen that once you are reminded of the thing, once you are exposed to the learning condition once again, once you go through the topic of your learning once again, very easily you would remember the entire thing. You will relearn it quite smoothly. Exactly that is what is happening in case of the dog here, which is known as spontaneous recovery. You see, what happens is that here is a graph here. On the x-axis you can see time, that is with passage of time. Then on the y-axis you have strength of reinforcement. The curve shows that initially there was a learning curve for conditioning, it was conditioned. Then you stopped giving the reinforcement. Then there was the extinction, that is there was gradually loss of the response. Then you give a pause. You do not do anything. Then again you start with giving, when you give the initial stimulus, that is the bell in case of the dog, maybe the dog will start salivating. If you give meat powder in the first trial, in the second trial, very quickly the dog will reach the position, the point of conditioning where it earlier was, in much less number of trials. So this is the relation between time and strength of reinforcement. There is conditioning, there can be extinction, and after if a time gap is given, then you will find that there is spontaneous recovery, which will have to be maintained with appropriate reinforcement, as was done in case of the initial learning. There are also a few other factors which we must remember about classical conditioning. There are two things, one is known as generalization and the other is known as discrimination. You see, generalization means we have learned something, then we can use the same learning, we can transfer the same learning to other situations. So, suppose you have conditioned this dog with a bell. The bell has a particular sound of certain pitch, certain frequency, certain intensity. What would happen if the dog is exposed to a bell whose sound is somewhat different from the bell you used during conditioning? It has been found that so far the sound of the bell can be identified by the animal. Some kind of stimulus generalization takes place, that is, salivation occurs to other varieties of bells also, although the amount of salivation to the bells may be less. Actually, it has been found that the more distant the bell is, the sound of the second bell is from the initial sound of the bell, there is lesser amount of salivation, but there will be salivation nevertheless. So, the organism can identify similar situations and responds in a more or less similar way to those stimuli which are similar to the original one. Discrimination is exactly its opposite. Usually, for similar kinds of stimuli, generalization will occur. But suppose you want to teach the dog to discriminate between two kinds of bells. So, suppose for the initial stimulus, that is the initial bell, sound of the bell, suppose the intensity was 5 unit. You are trying to make the dog discriminate this 5 unit of sound from a sound of 3 unit. Initially, the dog will respond with generalization, that is, the dog will salivate in response to the sound of 3 units also. But then, if you consistently give the reinforcement, that is meat powder, in response to 5 units of sound, and you do not give the meat powder in response to 3 units of the sound, gradually the response to the 3 units of sound will be extinct, and if you never repeat the reinforcement, the dog will learn to discriminate between these two units it will respond in your desired way only to the first one where reinforcement has been given consistently. There is also another very important point, that is the counter conditioning. Counter conditioning means, suppose you conditioned your dog to an approach response, an anticipatory response in case of bell, that is, initially you gave meat powder in response to bell. Suppose you want to counter condition this dog, that is, you want to elicit withdrawal response in response to the bell. So now what you do is that whenever the dog listens to a bell, it starts salivating, but then you give an electric shock instead of the meat powder. So gradually the dog loses its approach response and learns a new withdrawal response, that is, it lifts its leg from the ground to avoid the shock. This is known as counter conditioning. There can be plenty of applications of classical conditioning in different fields. We can classical condition emotional responses, we can classical condition social attitudes, we can classical condition use it in psychotherapy and in producing psychopathological conditions also. I don't know if some of you have heard about the experiment by J.B. Watson on little Albert. Albert was a very small child, apparently a happy child also, and Albert had a pet rabbit, and he was very fond of that rabbit. Now what happened was that whenever the child was playing with the rabbit, the experimenter made a startling sound in the background. Whenever the child tried to touch the rabbit, the sound was there to frighten him. Gradually, it so happened that the startling response was associated not only with the sound but with the rabbit also. Gradually, it was generalized to all sorts of furry animals, even if they were very small or even if it was a blanket or something like that. So, the emotion of fear was conditioned classically here, that is, startle and fear response was associated with something which should not elicit fear response. You can easily see that this can explain phobias in different ways. Then there is the classical conditioning of social attitude by Gregory Razran. Razran did a very funny kind of experiment. He asked his subjects to express their attitude toward persons of different ethnic communities. It was found that initially the subjects, human subjects, they described different kinds of attitudes toward good for some and bad for others. It was found that for certain ethnic groups, they expressed a kind of negative attitude. But when this same discussion was associated with good food, yes, a good lunch, it was found that many of them gradually changed their opinion. So you can classically condition social attitude also. So far as psychopathological condition can be explained by classical conditioning, we have already talked about phobia. It is believed by many that this kind of conditioning, not done of course deliberately, but somehow we have been exposed to similar situations where we have classically conditioned to develop a kind of fear for certain things which should not naturally elicit fear. Sometimes it has been said that certain somatoform disorders or kind of diseases that were earlier called psychosomatic diseases, they can also be classically conditioned owing to some unfortunate repeated associations. So you can also see that this has very important implications for child rearing practices also, because the way our children are exposed to different stimuli, not always under our conscious control, that is also very important here. We can use it for psychotherapy as well. One very famous example of use of classical conditioning in psychotherapy is by Ulpe. Ulpe developed a method called systematic desensitization. Now, systematic desensitization means that whenever there is a phobia or a kind of fear, the patient is initially shown something which is not very threatening but which remotely resembles, almost dissimilar but has some kind of similarity with the original stimulus. For example, if somebody is afraid of snakes, a picture of snake can be, or the name of a snake can be your initial stimulus. The patient is asked to look at the stimulus and try to relax. The patient can do it relatively easily. Then when the patient has practiced complete relaxation with, say, the picture of a snake, gradually a toy snake is exposed. This way, gradually the phobia or the fear is addressed, and step by step the subject, the patient, is desensitized through counter conditioning so that there is no more fear or no more phobia. So this is more or less the summary of classical conditioning. I will finish with just one or two criticisms that have been forwarded against classical conditioning. One is that it is not very much cognitive in nature because it deals mainly with reflexive behavior. Secondly, some persons have said that classical conditioning for treating diseases may not be very ethical, particularly if aversive kind of conditioning is used, that is, negative conditioning is used. All these criticisms are true, yet classical conditioning has still immense possibility in certain areas of our behavior, and we still do have plenty of utilities of classical conditioning in different domains of behavior management.